I recognize the member from Fredericton-South and leader of his party.
Thank you, Madam President. So, like the Minister from Albert, Madam Speaker, I agree. We need to have a grown-up conversation on how best to address the climate crisis. You know, there's no place left on the planet to put the carbon that is going into our atmosphere and into our oceans as a result of burning gasoline and diesel fuel and oil and coal and natural gas. The atmosphere and oceans are overflowing with carbon. No room left for our garbage. That's the emergency. That's why our climate has become unhinged and our oceans are acidifying, Madam Speaker. This is about the future generation as well as today's generation, Madam Speaker. We already see the consequences in frequent, violent weather. We're all experiencing that, with catastrophic and costly consequences, Madam Speaker. The cost side, the other cost side of the climate ledger. Climate change is driving up the cost of food, Madam Speaker. The member for Albert spoke about the price of Easter treats, and people having difficulty affording them this Easter, he says, because of the carbon tax. But in fact, the cost of chocolate, Madam Speaker, has gone through the roof, driven up there by climate change because of the impact on the cocoa crops. Madam Speaker, there was a piece on the news just last night about how much more expensive chocolate Easter treats are because of climate change. We know it's eroding our coasts with significant costs, Madam Speaker, significant costs. We know it's undermining our infrastructure. It's delivered Lyme disease to New Brunswick with significant costs. It's killing fir trees from Woodstock to Rogersville, which have significant costs. It's wreaking havoc with our marine and river fisheries. It's driving species extinct. And it's fueling forest fires like we've never seen, leaving hellscapes in their wake. The list goes on and on. Big costs, big problem. And everyone has a part to play. Canada is among the top 10 emitters in the world, while also extracting a considerable amount of carbon from the ground to be exported and burned elsewhere, primarily in the United States. Recognizing this threat, Madam Speaker, back in 1992, the nations of the world actually gathered in Brazil to sign a global treaty and agreed to take what steps were necessary to avoid dangerous climate change. That was 32 years ago, Madam Speaker. Brian Mulroney was the Prime Minister, and he signed on behalf of Canada and all Canadians. 23 years ago, 23 years later, going on 10 years ago, in 2015, those same nations, party to that treaty from 1992, signed by Brian Mulroney, committed themselves to cutting their carbon emissions in order to keep the world from warming by more than 2 degrees Celsius and to strive to keep it below 1.5, because they all agreed that's what constitutes dangerous climate change. So, Madam Speaker, that leaves us all, municipally, provincially, federally, and as citizens, to play our role to decarbonize our society, and the economy that meets our society's needs, or is supposed to meet our needs. So how to do this? Well, we need a full suite of measures, Madam Speaker. Pricing carbon is just one of them. Public investment, public financing, public incentives, legislation and regulation to help us decarbonize our society and our economy. In the summer of 2016, an all-party committee of this legislature, MLAs from all parties, traveled the province holding hearings to hear from the general public as well as experts about the measures they believe the New Brunswick government should implement to begin decarbonizing our society. That resulted in a serious, well-received report supported by all members from all parties on that committee, containing specific recommendations for the government to implement, which did include the full suite of measures mentioned: legislation, regulations, public investment in things like public transportation, so there was a way of using less gasoline, a way of driving less with convenient, accessible public transportation, to invest in that as modern infrastructure for the 21st century, Madam Speaker. Unfortunately, the recommendations, the plan, essentially, the MLAs, the all-party committee of MLAs, had put together based on the input they had received, was watered down by the Gallant Liberals in their climate action plan with no implementation strategy. Then the Higgs government replaced it with an even weaker plan, which sets deadlines far off into the future, deadlines for action. In fact, when you look at, Madam Speaker, the projections for the future that the Department of Environment and Climate Change makes on their website about where greenhouse gas emissions are going between now and 2029, they're not going down. They're basically flat in their projections, Madam Speaker, until we phase out coal at Baldoon as required by the Government of Canada. Between 2014 and 2019, across Liberals and Conservative governments, the emissions associated with transportation, all forms, Madam Speaker, increased from 3.3 megatons to 3.5 megatons. The emissions from the oil and gas sector, including the refinery, increased in that period, Madam Speaker, from 2014 to 2019. Those 5 years across two governments, from 3 megatons to 3.2 megatons. We don't have much to pat our backs for, Madam Speaker. And as I said, the projections of this government itself show no reductions in emissions until 2030, when coal at Baldoon must be phased out. Getting back to carbon pricing specifically, which is the focus of this motion, the Select Committee back then included a recommendation 81, which called on the government to develop a Made in New Brunswick carbon pricing mechanism rather than have one imposed on it by the federal government. Now, interestingly enough, Madam Speaker, in the 2008 federal election, both the Liberals and the Conservatives had carbon pricing commitments in their platforms. That's interesting. They were different. Liberals wanted a tax. The Conservatives committed to a cap and trading system, but both would put a price on carbon. And as the member for Restigouche-Schuller mentioned just recently, even more recently than that, the Conservatives federally had commitments around pricing carbon. Interesting. Today, two years later from the Select Committee's report in 2018, the federal government passed its Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. Now, Madam Speaker, under that piece of federal legislation, provinces can create their own systems to meet the requirements of the federal law, or decide have Ottawa apply a carbon tax. Now, in creating our own systems as provinces, Madam Speaker, carbon-containing fuels like gasoline, oil, coal, and natural gas can be priced directly through a dedicated tax, as currently is the case here, as a result of the federal system being adopted, or through a cap-and-trade market system. Premier Higgs initially chose to adopt his own carbon tax, which we'll remember, Madam Speaker, he used largely to reduce income taxes in this province. That's what he used the revenue for. Quebec, for example, opted to price carbon by establishing a cap-and-trade market system rather than a direct carbon tax. Now, in a cap-and-trade system, the caps determine the required emissions reductions, and the market determines the price of carbon through the trading of carbon permits. So that's the other option. Quebec uses that, and other provinces use the carbon tax directly, and then some have handed it back to the federal government to have them impose their system. So what happened in New Brunswick? Well, in February of last year, the Premier handed control over the carbon pricing system used in New Brunswick to Ottawa, completely in contradiction to his previous commitments about a made in New Brunswick system, in contradiction to the consensus report and recommendations of the Select Committee on Climate Change and of this Legislative Assembly to have a made in New Brunswick system. He handed the whole thing back to Ottawa, giving us the current federal carbon tax and dividend system, the dividend system being the part where checks are returned every 3 months. Since that time, he's done nothing but attack it, in concert with his Conservative colleagues in other provinces and in the federal government, or sorry, in the House of Commons. To see this as anything but politically motivated, Madam Speaker, is to stretch your imagination. Attacking the carbon tax for many Conservative politicians has become a thinly veiled signal that they oppose climate action, period. They don't want to do anything. And clearly, the projections of the Department of Environment in our own province showing no reductions in emissions between now and the coal phase out in 2030 would seem to reinforce that. On the other side of the street, the Prime Minister signals his virtuous commitment to climate action in his vigorous defense of the carbon tax. So it's come to be a kind of metaphor for climate action. If you're against the carbon tax, you're against climate action. If you're for the carbon tax, it's the climate action plan. It's the way to do it. What we need to be examining with respect to pricing carbon, Madam Speaker, is how to put a price on carbon that gets results, along with implementing all the other measures that have proven to be effective. A recent analysis by the Canadian Climate Institute found a carbon price on heavy industrial polluters is by far the country's most impactful policy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions over the next 6 years compared to the other policies that are currently out there. They said pricing carbon. According to the Canadian Climate Institute, the industrial carbon price will be responsible for between 20 and 48% of all emission reductions by 2030, based on the current menu of policies that are out there for cutting emissions. While the consumer price on carbon will be accountable for, they estimate, 8 to 14% of the reductions. Why the dramatic difference, Madam Speaker? Well, industry, we know, is price sensitive, price responsive, and will routinely in any company make investments to try and cut their costs. Cut their costs, increase their profitability, Madam Speaker. They, as economists say, respond rationally to a price on carbon, and they find ways to consume less carbon as a result, through a whole variety of measures, Madam Speaker, that cut the emissions. The evidence internationally is similar in terms of the greater impact of a price on carbon for industry than on the consumers directly. Consumers, on the other hand, Madam Speaker, are not very responsive to changes in energy prices. We've seen gasoline prices go sky high because of international oil prices, and then come back down and go sky high in the period of a season or 2 seasons in the year, Madam Speaker. But that doesn't have a great impact on gasoline consumption, Madam Speaker. The culture, the car culture is strong, Madam Speaker. The advertising is strong. We all love, our particular vehicles, and so sometimes our identities are wrapped up in those vehicles, sadly. So you don't have to look any further than the number of, dominance of fuel inefficient vehicles on the road today, despite much higher gas prices than we have now just a year ago, for example. So why is that? Well, there's little way in the alternatives, Madam Speaker, to driving. Prices go up. This government and past governments have failed to build out a convenient, accessible, affordable public transportation infrastructure in our province to provide an alternative to driving and to provide transportation to those people who don't have cars. There is no regularly budgeted investment in urban transit or city transit, Madam Speaker. There's no investment in inter-city or inter-community or inter-region public transportation, Madam Speaker. There's no conversations with, as far as I can tell, with Via Rail about developing a regional rail system in the province, even getting back regular service between Campbellton and Moncton and the other way around. It's not happening, Madam Speaker, despite the fact that in the past a lot of people used that train from Campbellton to Moncton to go to medical appointments, go for treatment, Madam Speaker. And now 3 days a week, well, it doesn't fit into that schedule very well. So there needs to be an alternative, and a visionary government would be making those investments to ensure the infrastructure is in place to provide that alternative. Under the current industrial carbon tax regime designed and administered by this government, the heavy industrial polluters in New Brunswick pay far less for their carbon emissions than the average New Brunswick family. Why would that be? Why would that be? When we know all the evidence shows that, and economists agree, that industry is quite responsive to price signals and will make changes to try and avoid those increased costs. Industry pays a carbon tax on only a tiny portion of their actual emissions. According to energy analyst Ralph Torrey in a recent commentary in the journal or magazine Corporate Knights, one of the largest oil companies in Canada, as an example, Suncor, paid just $1.67 per ton of their ton of carbon emissions in 2020, while Canadians in 2020 were paying $30 per ton. Once again, the unfairness in the system, Madam Speaker, where citizens are carrying the weight and heavy industry is getting nearly a free ride. It's not only unfair, Madam Speaker, but it's ineffective. Like I've already suggested, as Tory writes, we need to double down on industrial carbon pricing. And we can. You know, as I mentioned earlier, under the federal legislation governing pricing carbon, our province has the authority to design a system that puts greater emphasis on cutting emissions from the large industrial carbon emitters while using the revenue to provide the kind of infrastructure I was talking about for things like public transportation, for provide financing to citizens to help them reduce their energy demands, to cut their energy costs at the same time as reducing their carbon footprint, making life more affordable for both transportation and home heating. Now, why wouldn't this government want to make life more affordable for people when it comes to their transportation and home heating, Madam Speaker? A system could be designed that would do this. So, Madam Speaker, if after this year's election I end up in the Premier's office, I'll take back control of carbon pricing from the federal government, as our Legislative Select Committee originally recommended in 2016, and I would price carbon through a cap and trade system to price carbon in the industrial, power and transportation sectors. This will ensure greater reliability in the emission reductions achieved at the most affordable cost. And, Madam Speaker, I have questioned at committee over and over and over again the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Environment and Local Government, on their spending from the Climate Change Fund. Do you apply any kind of filter to determine what is the most cost-effective use of those funds in terms of the number of tons you eliminate through expending those funds? cost per ton of carbon that is saved, Madam Speaker. How much are they paying to save how much carbon? Time and time again, Madam Speaker, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change have indicated they don't have any such measure. Don't even look at it. Don't even look at what the cost of the carbon emission reductions they're investing in might be. Why? Why wouldn't they want to do the most affordable thing, Madam Speaker, to get the greatest reductions in carbon emissions they can? Why is that test not in place? It doesn't make any sense. So when they talk about how concerned they are about affordability, it wears a little thin. So revenues from this kind of system that we can create under the current federal legislation, just so the Premier chose not to, would help New Brunswickers move along the road to decarbonization in a way, as I said, that would make life more affordable for them when it comes to their transportation, housing, and heating and power costs. Think province-wide retrofits of homes and rental properties and buildings with clear targets to renovate the building stock in this province, to get the energy demand down for heating and cooling, Madam Speaker. And when you reduce the energy demand for heating and cooling, you automatically reduce the carbon emissions associated with that. Talk about an affordability measure. Huge, huge savings and huge reduction in the carbon footprint associated with heating and cooling homes, offices, rental properties, and buildings, Madam Speaker. But we need a comprehensive suite of energy efficiency programs and financing mechanisms to achieve that, with clear targets about what percentage of the housing stock, building stock we want to see retrofitted by what time. We don't even have that for the enhanced energy efficiency program in terms of the total number of low-income households who are eligible for the free heat pump and energy-efficient retrofit program for their homes. There is no target, Mr. Speaker. There is just a waiting list, a long waiting list to access the program that only represents a certain percentage of the overall households that are eligible. No targets, but a long waiting list and not enough money to clean it up and clear it up, and then go out and encourage those who haven't yet signed up to encourage. That's what to benefit from this program. That would be a good target. Similarly, despite commitments in the past, there's still no financing program for those with moderate incomes, Mr. Speaker, to overcome the capital costs up front that are a barrier in many families to making those important investments in energy efficiency, retrofits, and converting over to things like heat pumps on the heating side. So that's one thing, one example. The second example, in terms of making transportation more affordable, Mr. Speaker, and giving people a real alternative to driving, is a provincial public transportation network of bus and rapid rail service, and budgeted investments in city and regional transit systems to reduce gasoline consumption as a result of our using our vehicles less. So both of these approaches will save New Brunswickers substantial money in their power bills, gasoline purchases, and transportation costs, helping to address the affordability crisis. But when it comes to affordability, all we hear about from this side of the government side of the House, Mr. Speaker, is the carbon tax, which the Bank of Canada says is responsible for, we'll call it the carbon price, because Quebec doesn't have a carbon tax, so the carbon price is responsible for 0.1% of the annual inflation rate, 0.1%. The number one issue for people when it comes to affordability, and I am certain that every MLA in this House experiences this in hearing from their constituents, is housing. So if government is serious about affordability, Mr. Speaker, we would see rent controls in place. We'd see rent controls. I mean, for the first time in living memory over the last couple of years, between rent controls, or the lack of rent control, unaffordable rent increases, and people in entire buildings being evicted, there are people on the street because they couldn't afford their rent. Because they couldn't afford their rent. So rent controls, Mr. Speaker, are critical to ensuring life is affordable for New Brunswickers. It's also, when it comes to housing, why we need effective incentives, more significant incentives than are in the budget to spur the building boom required for non-market housing that would be developed by non-profit, co-op housing, and non-profit developers. We need more portable rent supplements than this budget provides in terms of really addressing affordability for those most affected by the affordability crisis. And, Mr. Speaker, how about an expansion of the new direct-to-tenant rental benefit to include single people? This is a great thing. This is money came down from the federal government, and if your income is under $40,000, you can get a significant rental benefit to offset the cost of your rent. So I know I have constituents getting $600 a month to help offset their rent, Mr. Speaker. But it doesn't apply to single people who are not seniors, only to families. And if you're a senior and single, it applies. So let's expand it to single people who aren't seniors, Mr. Speaker. Let's increase the threshold above $40,000 of household income a little, Mr. Speaker, so that more people can benefit from this direct-to-tenant rental benefit. It only really began to be available in January. Most people still don't know about it, Mr. Speaker. In fact, in the budget, it made it sound like only those people on the MB housing waiting list are eligible, but it's not true. The criteria are clear. If you're a senior, even single senior, or family with a household income of under $40,000, you qualify. Call now, 211, get your package and apply. We need to expand that, Mr. Speaker, if we really are serious about addressing affordability, since housing is the #1 affordability concern of every New Brunswicker in this province, unless they're wealthy. Staying with housing, a suspension of the provincial sales tax, part of the HST, on building new affordable rental units to match the suspension of the GST the federal government has given it to, would help spark the kind of building boom in affordable housing we need. Those are the kind of things that we need to be focusing on, this government needs to be focusing on in terms of addressing the affordability crisis, Mr. Speaker. Yet, all we hear about is histrionics over the carbon tax. The European Union and the United States now are both looking at imposing tariffs on carbon-intensive imports. What does that mean, Mr. Speaker? Well, if our industry, as it does now, exports into the United States, and they are not doing their fair share to address the cost of their carbon consumption, Mr. Speaker, they will pay tariffs if this goes ahead. They will pay tariffs. So even if the Premier and his Conservative colleagues across this country were successful in eliminating carbon pricing in Canada at some point, our export-oriented industries would then be hit with tariffs from our biggest trading partners and would still be paying a carbon price. It's a global problem. And where there are global solutions, they're moving forward. And part of those global solutions are, as countries move forward to decarbonize, they do not want their industry to be uncompetitive with those who are doing nothing. So countries like the United States, our biggest trading partner, and the European Union are contemplating putting on these import tariffs, Mr. Speaker, on carbon-intensive imports. Carbon border adjustments. It's the jargon, and you'll see it increasingly. So it gets back to my original point about carbon pricing and climate action. We need to be talking about how best to utilize carbon pricing to affect change in the most affordable way. When I say change, moving towards decarbonization, Mr. Speaker, and two, what are the broader suite of measures that need to be put in place that in many cases will address both affordability and helping decarbonize our society and economy while being a catalyst for new green business in this province, Mr. Speaker. There is a lot of talk about in the media about growth rates in New Brunswick. Well, you have to say, when you're talking about growth in what? And the growth we're missing is the growth in the new green economy, the growth in new green businesses, Mr. Speaker. As I had mentioned earlier, that there's a bill before the House now on enabling biogas, so renewable gas, to be injected into the gas pipelines, reducing the amount of fossil gas in those pipelines that the pipelines are carrying, Mr. Speaker. There's one company in New Brunswick that works in that field as a sort of engineering consulting firm focused on things like biogas, yet they have had no work, to my knowledge, in New Brunswick at all, because we haven't had the right policy environment in place. I'll never forget going to Siemens, Canada, Centre of Excellence for the smart grid, here in Fredericton, in New Brunswick, some years back, to find out what great things they're doing in New Brunswick to move us forward. That's going to help create new businesses in the green economy, Mr. Speaker. And after they went around the table, I guess 12 different people talked about their work. Their work was everywhere but New Brunswick. Other parts in Canada, other places around the world, Mr. Speaker, helping to create green businesses and reduce carbon emissions elsewhere, but not here, because we didn't have the policy environment to drive the shift to a green economy. That was an eye-opener, Mr. Speaker, I'll say. So these things go in tandem. Moving towards decarbonization, growing the green economy, particularly the green energy sector, Mr. Speaker, and taking advantage of the opportunities and catalyzing entrepreneurship in that area, Mr. Speaker, while increasing affordability for people. Because really, in the end, all these excess carbon emissions represent waste. And you eliminate waste, or you reduce waste, you're going to save money. If you're eliminating the energy, some of the energy required to heat or cool your home, that's waste. You're saving money. You're also reducing carbon emissions. Same thing for driving, Mr. Speaker. You make the decision to buy a more fuel-efficient vehicle, you're going to reduce your carbon emissions. You're going to save money on gasoline, Mr. Speaker, and there's a regulation that does need to be improved, because currently fuel efficiency regulations only apply to sedans, not to trucks, not to SUVs, and that largely is an American problem. Obama, we're going to include all vehicles under the fuel efficiency requirements in the U.S., which would impact us. And then when President Trump was elected, he got rid of it, and now Biden looks like he's trying to bring it back in before the election. So there's an effective regulation, Mr. Speaker, to lower the fuel consumption of our vehicles, lower the weight of our vehicles to reduce fuel consumption. And those are choices that can be made. And over time, there's incentives, of course, and disincentives that would encourage people to make those kinds of choices. So carbon pricing is and will be always a relatively small part of the suite of measures that we need to ensure that we do our part to decarbonize New Brunswick in the global fight to avoid climate breakdown, to do our fair share, to do our part. Mr. Speaker, the world is on fire, and it's affecting people today. and it's only going to get worse. There is no new normal, as I hear people say. It's only going to get worse as the climate continues to destabilize, and the consequences of that wreak more and more havoc around the world, Mr. Speaker. We need to do our share, our fair share, to put it out. You know, when the world descended into war twice in the 20th century, Canadians and New Brunswickers stepped up despite our small size in the global context.
Punched above our weight, too.
Canadians and New Brunswickers weren't able to defeat the Nazis by ourselves. No one was saying we would. But that was not an argument against us doing our part. We, to this day, carry a great reputation for the contribution we made in both of those world wars, as New Brunswickers, as Canadians. And those world wars were won, not by us alone, but we did our part. And many will say we did more than our part. So, Mr. Speaker, today the world is in a race, an urgent race to decarbonize before it's impossible to turn back the cataclysm of climate breakdown and ocean acidification. The giant current in our ocean from the North Atlantic to the South Atlantic is slowing down. Because why? Because of the gasoline and the oil and the natural gas and the coal that's burned, and the continued expansion of extracting natural gas and oil from the ground to be burned. On top of that, this is a time to step up, Mr. Speaker, take risks, be bold, and yes, draw on that stubborn strength New Brunswickers are known for. It runs deep in our psyche. It's got us through tough times in the past, and we have overcome those challenges. This is no time for amateur hour, Mr. Speaker. We need to step up and do our part. And, Mr. Speaker, I intend to lead that effort. Thank you.